Welcome to this special episode of Put Simply, the second of a four-part series looking into the Express Pearl disaster in Sri Lanka. If you haven't listened to the first episode, you should. So go back on the platform you find this podcast and listen to part 1, where we go through the context of why we're looking into this environmental catastrophe. Today on part 2, we look at the science and the legal claims against the shipping company. My name is Erdem Koch, and my co-hosts are Rodney McCune and Ozan Ibrisim. Gents, good to be back with you both.
Good to be
Great
back.
to be with you.
Good to be on board.
Rodney, let's start with some context setting. For those who haven't listened to part 1, can you give us the summary of what the Express Pearl disaster is?
Yeah, sure. I'll be very quick. Obviously, it's better to go back and listen to part 1. But if you don't have time, this container ship, the Express Pearl, left Jebel Ali in the UAE. Shortly after departure, it was found to have a leaking container. Its next stop was Hamad Port in Qatar, where it tried to offload this leaking container. It was refused in Qatar. It then went Harris in India and again attempted to offload this container and again refused and continued its journey. So after some 10 days at sea or something, it arrives in Colombo in Sri Lanka. Again, raises the flag about this issue, requests an inspection from the authorities in Colombo because there'd been some suggestion of smoke and potentially a fire. Fire hazard or fire response from Sri Lankan Navy and Colombo Port came on board, assessed the urgency as non-urgent, and left to go and sort of think about what their next steps might be. And in the meantime, a fire developed on board the ship, which burned for days. There's questions around the fire response dealt with in part 1, and tragically this ship was lost with a large volume of chemicals and plastic nurdles and other types of pollutants, which then forms the backdrop to a legal claim for some $6.5 billion US against the ship operators. And that's what really caused me to say, well, where do we go next? Well, I think it must be the environmental assessment and evidence and damage to see how on earth $6.5 billion of damage could occur. Maybe it can, maybe it can't. That's what we're going to find out in this episode.
Yeah, really good summary. Thank you, Rodney. And again, let's reiterate the need to go back and listen to part 1 to have the full details and the full scope of what this catastrophe was and what it means. But let's look at the environmental implications now. What actually happened as a result of this ship sinking?
Yeah, so what happened is the Marine Environment Protection Agency in Sri Lanka swung into action as part of the response with the ship owner. They brought some expert overseas help called International Tanker Federation or something. ITOF it's called, external experts. And they worked together, although the Sri Lankans led on the ground, the costs were then picked up externally in terms of the cleanup and response. And they then collected what evidence of harm they could get, identify, and whatever assessments that were necessary for finding out what the overall environmental impact was. And following court proceedings where I think we dealt with this last week, but initially it was taken by fishermen because compensation paid to the government from the shipping company hadn't been handed on. You've got to bear in mind that, Sri Lanka's government changed about a year ago, and we discussed this previously, but this was under the previous government, which had a strong, I'm going to say, cloud of not always doing things properly sitting above its head. This happened during their time, and these proceedings were launched, and they were trying to force the government to pass on this money. And over a period of time, again, before the current government came in, these proceedings morphed into a constitutional rights petition before the Supreme Court in Sri Lanka. And evidence had to be produced before that court. And the Marine Environment Protection Agency was the basis of the evidence that assessed oil spill, nitrogen release into the water, air pollution, damage to marine environment, including wildlife or animals, and so on. And they set this out as well as impact on fishing communities and so on. And they set this out in a report, and they quantified the different areas of claim or complaint, and ultimately that stacked up to a huge 6.5 billion US dollars.
Obviously, we're all serious nerds on this podcast and have read the entirety of the report. But some of the things that I found very interesting, particularly around, of course, I read the report and had a look at it, but then some of the criticisms of the report, it seems that a lot of the basic steps that you would take when you're trying to get an assessment of the damage that was caused weren't taken. I mean, some of them include, for example, having very weak environmental monitoring by the authorities, limited or incomplete. And for example, the oil spill part of it wasn't properly monitored. And that was also something I believe that was put into the final claim. But there was no real studies that kind of link that oil presence to the damage that was caused to the environment. Other things around the nitrogen sampling being inadequate and really relying on surface only samples and happening at only kind of single time points. These sorts of things you would expect the norm in most of these types of reports that come out in terms of gathering this sort of information. Another one you could look at is the air pollution. I believe that the monitoring only covered a very small period of the kind of 10 days of the fire that took place. I assume these are things that you would really need to get right before you could come up with a claim of $6.5 billion dollars.
Yeah, I mean, Ozan, I expected when I read the scientific analysis produced by the Marine Environment Protection Agency and, read the judgment and so on, that it would be gold standard. It would be beyond reproach, both in accuracy and academic rigor and all those other things, proper, robust analysis. And I used to be a lawyer. Okay, I wasn't a lawyer in this space. If there was DNA analysis or fingerprint analysis before a court, it would have to be top notch before it would
Well,
be
particularly when you're asking for 6.5 billion in
right,
damages. I mean,
exactly,
you would have to
exactly.
assume
You would think it's the
you've kind of
best.
crossed your T's and dotted your I's.
Yeah, and so therefore, the first red flag on that was the partner organization that was brought in, ITOF, was heavily critical of the MIPA analysis, the Marine Environment Protection Agency domestic analysis. They were at such variance that one would have thought someone's completely wrong or the truth lies in the middle. It was so stark that both reports were actually put before the court in Sri Lanka, but they took the view that the International Reporting Organization were not sufficiently independent, and we'll come on to discuss the legal proceedings in a future episode, but therefore set that aside and only looked at the domestic report. And this MIPA, and again we'll come on to discuss the legal proceedings, Environment Protection Agency, the chair was disposed of as a result of this, found to be in statutory breaches of their legal obligations under the Constitution and so on. But still, their analysis was, seized upon as the basis for making out this particular claim. And you're right. When it came to the oil spill, for example, they used the incorrect type of oil, which has a density issue, which automatically reduces the level of environmental impact, both in terms of impact assessment, but also in terms of numbers. They didn't quantify the spill volume properly, or at least had inconsistent scoring in relation to that. There was a question about the cost per gallon that they used in order to value again the oil spill. So what you had within one area of claim is three or four assumptions that were not sufficiently robust to stand up to the number. So I went off and spoke to other scientists, and what I found was that the analysis across all of the areas of claim by the Marine Environment Protection Agency that makes out this 6.5 billion was either unsupported, inaccurate, or inconsistent in terms of their assumptions. Sometimes They offered no methodological detail. Sometimes they contradicted their own numbers. Sometimes the valuation framework was incorrect or certainly inappropriate for Sri Lanka. They used figures related to the Baltic Sea when it came to nitrogen, and when they came to assess potential health impacts, they used the medical cost had any medical response been required in the EU, which is obviously much higher, and again, really inappropriate for Sri Lanka. And I think this is probably the most damning comment, apart from saying that, a lot of this lack transparency, accountability, or accuracy. And in
I
fact,
mean,
sometimes sources were cited whereby whereby they would say we used this source, and when you go to the source, instead of being a figure of X%, it was a third of that or a quarter of that was what they should have been using had they applied the academic source properly. And it was summarized as where their evidence base was weakest, they attached the highest values. It's crazy. I mean, that is
I,
crazy if that's a proper scientific expert critiquing a government report substantiating the biggest claim in a country's history.
what I also find fascinating was really basic errors that were clearly, I guess, committed from the cleanup effort. I understand that they used things like heavy machinery and other kind of methods to do the cleanup, which contributed even further to the damage to the ecological system. And that obviously wasn't factored into it all, but it seemed like the cleanup effort was also responsible for a substantial amount of the damage that was caused to the environment. Saying that, I also found it incredible that the kind of, and you touched on this earlier, but the impact, I believe the report highlighted that the impact, was on 20,000 workers who were impacted by this, but it was a gross misrepresentation or underrepresentation of the actual situation as well. So maybe we can go into to why this report was written and what was the kind of the agenda here.
So interestingly, I've spoken to people in country, and most of them are prepared to say, I'm happy to share this, but don't say that I said it. And of course, this is going back to the previous government, not the current government. And the constant theme was that it was seen as an opportunity to inflate an expense so that payments could be extracted throughout the process. Now, during the time of this, there were criminal complaints against MIPA, the Marine Environment Protection Agency, saying they overpaid for some of the services that they engaged with money paid for by the shipping company or their insurers. So there are those types of complaints in the area, but it was described as a cushion, inflated to facilitate other payments, and sadly as a little bit of an opportunity. Now, clearly, the Environment Protection Agency has changed since then, but the report that was produced, a couple of years ago, they would have to disown now, and that's always difficult for any government agency or civil service authority, even when you get a change of government, to get that type of brutal review of your own performance. But it feels to me, having spoken to other scientists, proper experts in the field, that that's where this may end up. And as another environmental scientist pointed out to me, it feels a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. What you have here is an exaggerated environmental impact, or an inaccurate one, that undermines the credibility of other environmental assessments which are properly sound, and weakens trust in the whole basis in which environmental claims are brought. And that's really not an outcome that anyone, wherever you sit in relation to something like this, wants to see. You want to see a process that everyone can buy into, that can be trusted, and then therefore the outcomes or the product of that can be accepted. Yeah, it doesn't feel like it in this particular case. Then you touched on the curiosity of the nitrogen stuff and the figures that were used in the air pollution, but you got to bear in mind that of this 6 billion, 4.5 billion was being attributed to the lack of tourism as a result of the death of I think the claim was 400 dead turtles. Some of those were subject to autopsy, and one environmental analyst who reviewed that aspect told me that something like 60 to 70% the cause of death was not attributed to the incident, and that there was an increased level of turtle deaths at that time of the year due to the monsoon season in any event. So even if there was an elevated amount, imagine that on its own was wrong. You're talking about an adjustment of 2/3 reduction from what, 4.5 billion to 1.5 billion, that you can scrub off 2 billion on the basis of like one adjustment. But there were also issues around the quantification of the value of a turtle over this life cycle and so on, and what its value is to the population. And yeah, I mean, we could go into this, and there was some which the post-mortem they say a person told me said the turtle had died as a result of a boat strike, and yet here it was as part of this incident on the slab in a turtle mortuary, being said that its significant value was being attributed to what happened. I also read separately criticism of the previous government's response, and that they were overstretched. But one of the difficulties around loss of confidence in fish consumption was a very poor and weak government risk analysis and then communications plan. And, you know, this is at the time when we were all dealing with COVID and so on. And, you know, governments were better tuned into their ability to communicate directly with the public. And notwithstanding that, that was a double fail, both in knowing when they could say fish were safe to eat or consume, and also doing it. And again, that's like, I don't know. I mean, I just hope that when the dust settles and people review all this from an incident, or I would hope that, you know, people can learn and improve, whether it be government and communication, something that we're all interested in, or whether it be in data collection and scientific analysis, or just whether it's in being accurate on stuff. If you're going to ask, you know, it's like if you go to a nice restaurant and you want to charge a big price, you expect it to be very well delivered in terms of quality of food and service. And it feels like this is a big price with, it's unfair to McDonald's, isn't it? But a
Uh,
burger bar type product.
I think to be very clear and put on the record that none of us during this episode are questioning that there was damage done to
Absolutely.
the environment. And I think
Absolutely.
that's something that we need to be very clear about. But at the same time, we also have to highlight that if you're going to ask for compensation for that damage, first and foremost, as we discussed in the first episode, that damage could have been avoided and it wasn't. Now we're at a point where you're asking for damages, then you need to be very methodical and systematic and transparent and honest about the damage, and there needs to be a system or a process that people can trust, including the courts that now are hearing this damage claim. I think
Yeah, yeah, a
that's
hundred
very
percent.
important to highlight,
Because
because I don't
judges
want
aren't
people walking.
scientists either, Ozan.
No, absolutely, and
Yeah.
they rely on experts, as you said, and I think the point of what we're trying to kind of talk about today is really around how that expert opinion was based on very, very, very bad evidence, very bad science, and in some ways very bad intentions. And I think that's really the kind of key takeaway. It's not that we're downplaying the environmental kind of
Impact,
damage.
absolutely.
It was a very unfortunate situation, I think, But, if we're going to go through a process and we're going to get people to pay compensation, and also to ensure that the compensation goes to the right people, I think that's a
Which seemed to
very
have been a
key.
problem in this case as well, sadly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key part of all of this. We need to make sure that that expert opinion is right and the due compensation is paid to the right people.
Yeah, look, these are all really important points. And yeah, I mean, I just still feel a bit, shocked about the weaknesses in an expert report to substantiate a massive claim. I mean, as a former lawyer who dealt with expert evidence, I've never quite seen a divergence of opinion so significant where you have the outlier as being the government or the claimant report. The outlier is usually the other way around. It's the response. And in this situation, it feels like the outlier is the claim and everyone else is questioning it on their own expertise and knowledge. We can talk about outliers. We've touched on the legal process, and perhaps, in our next episode, we can sort of delve into that side of it a little bit further and see, based on this single source of expert evidence, what else happened in a court case that concluded with such a large interim payment being awarded, which was 1 billion of the 6 billion, and recommendations to dig for further potential areas and evidence of claim.
Definitely something we will pick up on the next episode as we work through the various components of this in this special 4-part series of Put Simply. Gents, thank you so much both for your time this week. See you on the next one.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.